Lucas Willis, my grandson, and the future of this firm. 200 VIP guests applauded. There was no grandson named Lucas. My father had just invented a child to unlock $3.8 million in inheritance. My mother stood beside him, smiling perfectly. The same woman who 22 years ago watched me get thrown out into the rain at 16, pregnant, and said nothing. I placed the notarized document from 2004 onto the projector, and the red stamped text filled the screen, relinquishing all obligations to Grace Willis and her descendants. My father leaned into the microphone. "This is blackmail." He said that in front of all of Portland's upper class, to hide the $1.2 million in bridge loan debt drowning his law firm. They needed a male heir. They invented one. What they didn't know was that I had known that before I ever walked into this room. "Hi, I am Grace. If your own parents ever treated you like a liability or a system error, hit like to stand with me tonight. Now let me take you back to the room where cruelty dressed in silk first started to come undone." My heels hit the Heathman's marble floor with a sound that did not apologize for itself. Each step produced a clean, dry report, the kind that traveled through the room's layered ambiance of string music and expensive perfume without asking for space. I did not enter as a daughter returning. I entered as someone conducting an assessment of a structure whose foundation I already knew was compromised, moving through the grand ballroom's entrance with the unhurried attention of a person who has already counted every exit and needs only to confirm their locations. The room ran long and high-ceilinged, the kind of space designed to make guests feel permanently elevated by association. White lily arrangements standing 4 and 5 feet tall in brass urns at 10-foot intervals along the walls. Crystal chandeliers throwing amber light down onto the cream-colored table linens. The smell of signature candles and aged wine and someone's perfume layered into the air until the combination suggested wealth as a natural condition rather than a constructed one. 200 invited guests occupied circular tables arranged in a shallow arc facing the raised platform at the far end of the room. I moved left along the periphery with Lily's elbow in my left hand, steering at a pace that was neither hurried nor recognizable as intentional. I had the folder in my right hand. It was the color of old bone, not manila anymore, the color having drained across 22 years into something cooler and more permanent. The cover surface was matte and slightly rough against my thumb, the kind of texture that comes from decades of temperature changes and the oils of the single pair of hands that had handled it with any consistency. My hands. I had retrieved it from the county recorder's office archive myself in the fall of 2018, on a Wednesday afternoon while Lily was at school, and I had carried it home and sat with it on my kitchen counter for 11 minutes before I understood that 11 minutes was the right amount of time and that I was not going to need longer. I had not put it in a bag for tonight. I wanted it to be seen. I placed it against my hip at a slight outward angle, cover facing the room, as I crossed the open floor toward the document projector that had been requested as part of the evening's program setup. I had added it to the event order 6 weeks ago, listed under technical equipment, described as a presentation tool for the keynote remarks. The event coordinator had confirmed it without comment. He was on the platform. I did not look at him directly until I was 4 feet from the projector table, but I had tracked his position from the moment I entered. The slight elevation gave him a sightline advantage he consistently used, and I had known where he would be standing within a range of about 3 feet. He was rotating the silver pocket watch with his thumb, the same continuous rotation I had memorized by age 8, the motion he made when something was happening that he had not approved in advance. His smile had not disappeared. It had simply lost its architecture, still present at the perimeter, but no longer held in place by whatever internal confidence had generated it before we entered the room. She stood immediately to his left in a gown of pale champagne-colored silk that fell in a long, clean line to the floor. Her right hand was wrapped around a crystal flute, and the flute was tilted at an angle that suggested she had forgotten she was holding it. The knuckles of that hand had whitened at the second joint. I noted a fine shiver running through the lower edge of her gown, a fabric movement generated by a tension she could not distribute anywhere else. I placed the folder on the mahogany surface of the projector table and aligned its long edge with the table's long edge, working it with my index finger until it was parallel to within a degree. I did not look up at the platform while I did this. I checked the projector's aperture with 2 fingers. The lens housing was cold and the focusing ring moved smoothly, and switched the unit on. A rectangle of blue-white light opened across the table surface, and the wall screen above the platform flickered to life. I found a thread of dust floating in the light beam and watched it drift 2 inches and stop. I waited. His footsteps came down off the platform without urgency, the deliberate pace of a man who wants to project that he has not been surprised. He stopped 2 feet from the table, and his voice came out low and compressed through his teeth. "Grace, what on earth do you think you're doing here? Tell Lucas to step forward right now before I have security walk that outfit straight out the door." His right hand was already in his breast pocket, already reaching for whoever he thought could solve this. He looked at Lily. His eyes moved across her face and posture with the searching attention of a man trying to find, in the person standing in front of him, the outline of someone he had invented for print. She stepped in from his left and placed one hand on his forearm with practiced calm, the 2-carat diamond catching the chandelier light as she moved. She did not look at me. She looked at the folder on the table. Her lips pressed into a single flat line, and her other hand worked a handkerchief from her clutch and pressed it to the side of her neck, where the heat had begun to collect along her collar. I pressed the projector's power button with the tip of my right index finger. The light expanded, sharpened, and the folder's cover filled the wall screen. The Oregon State Notary's stamp appeared in red, enlarged to a diameter of 3 feet. The text beneath it reading "Permanent relinquishment of all obligations to Grace Willis and descendants." 200 guests stopped moving. The carbonation in the champagne flutes made small, steady sounds in the silence, like a clock that would not stop. He stepped backward without intending to, and his shoulder contacted the floral arrangement on the lectern's corner, and white petals came loose and fell in a slow scatter across the stage floor around his feet. He was not looking at me anymore. His gaze had moved to the table across the room where his legal partners sat, and the look he sent in that direction was the look of a man who has just realized he needed someone else to come fix what he could not fix himself. The man at the partners' table stood with the careful deliberateness of someone who had spent his professional life being the person called in when the original arrangement had gone sideways. He buttoned his jacket at the center button. He smoothed both lapels from the notch downward with 2 fingers. He walked from his table to the platform with a pace that produced an even sequence of footfalls on the polished floor, each step spaced at the same interval. The tempo of a man performing the emotion of certainty because the actual certainty had left him somewhere between his seat and the lectern. He positioned himself between the lectern and the projector and rested one thick, dry hand on the projector's casing in a way that cast his shadow across the lower third of the notary seal on the screen. He did not look at me. He directed his full attention to the guest tables in the front rows, at the church elders in their buttoned suits, at the city council representative at table 3, at the 2 partners from his own firm who had come in from Seattle. His lips moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had spent 4 decades converting complicated situations into simple-sounding sentences. He spoke to the room, not to me. The document I had introduced was an outdated clerical instrument. The governing charter of the Willis Family Trust recognized a single legitimate successor for the purpose of asset activation, a named male heir, and this recognition superseded any collateral claims derived from prior administrative filings. My presence here constituted an attempt to leverage minor procedural inconsistencies in 22-year-old documents to advance an unsubstantiated claim for personal financial compensation. He said all of this without once looking at the folder on the table, and without once directing his eyes to the screen where the notary seal continued to sit in red silence. He reached inside his jacket and withdrew a gold fountain pen, rotated the cap with his thumb in a single practiced rotation, and held it pointed downward. I sat down in the chair beside the projector table. I settled my spine against the chair's back until it was straight. I placed both hands flat on my thighs, palms against the fabric of my vest, and beneath my left palm I could feel my own pulse at the wrist, steady and unremarkable. I fixed my eyes on him and did not blink at the rate that would have been normal for someone receiving information. I let him speak. In the space behind my sternum, I had already begun a list, organized numerically the way I organized everything that required precision. Error 1. He had been briefed on the version of me that existed in my father's account of this family, the version that had left at 16 with a suitcase and a signature and a $10 notary fee and had not been considered since. He did not know that I had spent 11 months acquiring a stake in the financial institution currently administering my father's bridge loan notes. He had not read my company's filings. He had not looked me up. He had looked up what my father told him, which is a very different category of research. Error 2. The Oxford enrollment records he was planning to present as foundation for the trust's succession claim were attached to email accounts registered through a mail forwarding service incorporated in Vancouver, Washington, 14 months ago. I had the incorporation records. I had the device registration. I had the purchase receipt from the electronics retailer on Northeast Sandy Boulevard, and I had 3 months of correspondence showing those accounts had been maintained by a person who signed her book club emails with a nickname she had used since the 1980s. He set the pen on the lectern surface with a sharp, declarative sound, the sound of a man closing a case, and looked out at the room with an expression designed to invite the audience to share his confidence. A sparse, tentative scattering of applause came from the middle tables, the kind produced by people who want to appear to have an opinion, but are not certain which opinion is safe. My mother released a breath. I watched her diaphragm settle under the silk, and allowed her eyes to move to me with what she had arranged to look like certainty. Her thumbnail moved in a small, repetitive arc against the balled handkerchief in her right hand. Error 3. In the past 4 minutes of carefully constructed legal language, he had referred to Lily 3 times, using the trust's statutory designation for an unrecognized collateral descendant. He had said it quietly, sliding it into subordinate clauses. The senior elder at the front table had heard it. I watched his hands, which had been resting open on the table, draw inward and fold together in the specific way of a man who has just registered something he will be required to address. That man had witnessed my parents' wedding 50 years before. What he had just heard in carefully professional language was that the 19-year-old girl sitting in this room tonight had no standing in the family he had been witnessing for half a century. And then the word arrived. The word that had been moving through this room like a frequency since the evening began, the word my father had used at the podium, and that this man had now used twice more in different syntactic contexts, the word that was supposed to hold the entire structure in place. Bloodline. It fell into the air, and it did not stay in the air. It traveled inward, and a door I had kept sealed for 22 years began, in the space between one breath and the next, to move. The word did not arrive as sound. It arrived as pressure, a sudden compression at the base of my sternum, like a flat stone dropped onto a frozen surface, no crack, only the force radiating outward through my ribcage in rings that were invisible to everyone in the room and completely specific to me. The chandelier light above the Heathman's ballroom elongated and smeared at its edges. The smell of white lilies and heated wax and expensive wine thinned and pulled back. What replaced it was immediate and absolute. Cold air, the particular metallic cold of a Pacific Northwest October night, and beneath it the smell of wet concrete and damp wool and the iron taste of rain at the back of the throat. I was not remembering. I was there. The porch light at the Willis house was off. The maple at the corner of the lot was already in its late October state, remaining leaves releasing in wet clusters in the wind, catching in the gutter above the porch, and dropping in slow, heavy groups onto my left shoulder. The suitcase at my left foot was hard-sided, a hand-me-down with a broken right wheel that caused the whole bag to list when rolled. I had packed it in 11 minutes. I had not been able to feel my hands properly for the past hour, and they had become unreliable instruments. I kept closing them around the plastic handle and releasing and closing again, not because the action helped, but because it was the only action I could still perform with certainty. Inside the window to the right of the front door, the entry hall was lit. The floor was the wide plank white oak that had been refinished the previous spring, and in the light from the overhead fixture it reflected like still water. He was standing in the center of the entry, holding a set of documents flat against his palms, perfectly horizontal. He was wearing the charcoal suit he reserved for depositions. His hair was combed and set. His pocket watch chain caught the light while he rotated the watch with his thumb and kept his eyes on the documents and not on the door. He bent and slid a page through the gap at the base of the door. The edge of the paper was already dimpling from the rain by the time I reached for it. His voice came through the glass, flattened and abbreviated. The voice of a man who has already completed the emotional transaction of this moment and is now engaged only in its procedural conclusion. Sign that. The $10 for the notarization is the last expenditure this family will make on your behalf. From this moment you have no father, no mother, and the child you are carrying has no name in this family's record. I picked up the pen he had threaded through the door gap. My hand was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with the fact that I was 16 years old and standing in the rain while the person on the other side of the door was my father. The ink spread at the corners of my signature. The paper had softened from the moisture, and what I produced was not my signature but a distorted version of it. The mark of someone signing for the last time while their hands have stopped cooperating. He removed the paper from the gap. The lock engaged. A single solid click. The deadbolt traveling fully home. I heard it clearly above the rain. She was visible through the lower portion of the window, crouched beside the baseboard 6 feet inside the door, working a folded cloth across the strip of hardwood floor nearest the threshold. Rain had come through the gap during the exchange. A small, narrow pool of water, no larger than an open hand, and she was addressing it with focused, efficient strokes, moving the cloth in parallel lines from left to right, her fingers pressing down firmly to lift the moisture from the grain. Her face was pointed downward. She completed the task in approximately 40 seconds, stood, folded the cloth in thirds, and walked in the direction of the kitchen. She did not look at the window. She did not look at the door. The pool of water was gone from the floor before I had moved from the porch. A crystal glass made contact with a porcelain surface somewhere in the Heathman ballroom. A sharp, high, specific sound, the kind produced by expensive things touching each other accidentally. That sound entered my ear, and the porch, and the rain, and the deadbolt went immediately and cleanly into the past tense. I was in my chair beside the projector table. The chandeliers were above me. The folder was under my right hand. I drew one breath and released it and inventoried my own body, hands steady, jaw released, spine still in its correct position. The memory did not leave the room with me. It did not dissolve. It underwent a change in state. From something open and unprocessed and capable of producing that specific compression in my sternum, to something finished and inert and dense, the way liquid becomes solid under the right conditions. The weight of it did not disappear. It relocated to a point just below my sternum where it would remain available not as a feeling, but as information. I looked at Lily beside me, her posture careful and still, her hair catching the amber of the chandeliers, her hands folded in her lap. 19 years old. The man at the lectern had referred to her tonight using the legal designation for a child who did not exist in the family's record. He had said it carefully so it would not be noticed. I had noticed. The senior elder had noticed. And I understood with a precision that had no warmth in it and required none, that every word spoken from that lectern tonight had been a preparation for this moment, and that I had been preparing for it far longer than any of them had been preparing to prevent it. I placed my right hand flat on the folder and pressed my feet flat against the stage floor and pushed the chair backward. The sound it made was long and deliberate and traveled across every table in the room. I stood. The chair cleared the floor behind me, and the sound of it reached the far tables before the visual registered for most of the room, and for the 2 seconds it took for both signals to arrive, the ballroom was in a state of held breath. I did not adjust my jacket. I did not smooth anything. My hands hung at my sides, and I took 2 steps forward to the position directly beside the lectern and stopped. My heels were flat on the stage floor, weight distributed evenly across both feet. I turned my head slowly from left to right across the front rows, giving each section of the audience 3 full seconds of uninterrupted attention. The senior elder at table 1 had leaned forward 3 inches. The attorney from Seattle had stopped pretending to check his phone. The associate, still standing to my left, had moved his fountain pen from one hand to the other and back again in the past 90 seconds. I had counted. I did not look at him yet. I reached into the folder with my right hand and withdrew the first document without looking down. I had organized the contents by touch, each section separated by a paper clip whose texture I could distinguish in sequence. This stock was standard print weight, slightly cool from having sat flat, and I placed it on the projector glass and moved it with 2 fingers until the relevant column aligned with the center of the screen. The text that expanded across the wall showed 2 things side by side: the official birth record filed with Oregon's Vital Statistics Office, which listed the child's name as female, and the amended church newsletter page, dated 18 months prior, which listed a Lucas Willis at the same date of birth. Both documents, on the same screen, together. I held my position and let the room read them. I counted my own breathing while the room processed what it was seeing, slow, deep, the count I used in boardrooms when the people on the other side of the table needed to arrive at a conclusion and required only sufficient silence in which to do it. Then I looked at the associate and I spoke at the volume of ordinary conversation. You used the word bloodline. You built your entire argument on that word. So explain. For the people at this table who have received your firm's correspondence for the past 2 years, why the bloodline you're defending required an Oxford University enrollment record registered to my daughter's legal name with a different name printed over it. His hands moved to his lapels. The pen transferred from right hand to left. His mouth opened, and the first sound it produced had no consonant in it. A partial vowel, a hesitation, visible and audible to anyone within 8 feet. He recovered within 2 seconds and restarted with a phrase about documentation hierarchies, and the phrase was syntactically complete and professionally constructed, but the 2 seconds before it were not recoverable. They had happened in front of the senior elder, in front of the Seattle attorneys, in front of 200 people who had come tonight expecting a celebration. The associate's weight shifted, barely perceptible. A redistribution from the balls of his feet to the heels, the posture of a person who is no longer advancing. My father's grip on the lectern tightened, the tendons along the top of his hand rising in 2 parallel ridges beneath the skin. She set her champagne flute on the nearest table without locating the surface properly, the base landing at the wrong angle, rocking twice before settling. She was pressing both thumbnails into the balled handkerchief now, the motion small and rhythmic and involuntary. I placed a second sheet on the projector glass. The original, unedited church newsletter from 3 years prior, showing the grandchildren section with a blank line where the name now appeared. 3 documents. The progression visible to everyone looking at the screen. I reached into the next section of the folder and let my fingers find the edge of what was inside. Before I show you what I drew from that section, the filing that would reduce this law firm to a line in a county dissolution record before Monday's business hours opened, I want to stop here for a moment, because I know some of you listening have been in a room like that one. Maybe not a ballroom, maybe a kitchen table, a hospital corridor, a parking lot. A room where someone with authority was using carefully arranged words to make the true account of your life sound like an overreaction, and you had to decide whether to stay quiet or say the next thing out loud. If you have ever stood in that room and spoken anyway, press like. Tell me about it in the comments, because I read every one of them, and I want to know where you found the ground under your feet. Now let me tell you what I placed on that table next, and why the man with the gold pen stepped backward before I had finished moving my hand. He brought his palm down on the lectern surface, and the impact was heavy and flat, the sound of something hollow being struck, and it produced, in the front rows, not renewed focus but a visible flinching, the small, involuntary recoil of people who have been startled by a sound carrying more desperation than authority. He began to speak at increased volume about a confidentiality provision embedded in the Willis Family Trust's governing document, citing a statute number and then a subsection number and then a clause number, layering legal specificity the way a person who is running short of substance layers terminology. He said the internal financial instruments of the trust were protected instruments. He said any attempt to introduce those instruments into a public forum constituted an actionable interference. He said the trust's sole administrator retained exclusive interpretive authority over all fiduciary disclosures. He continued building this structure of language while I stood beside the projector table and opened the second section of the folder. My fingers found the document I needed by the slight change in paper weight. This stock was heavier than standard print paper, with a surface texture that was smoother at the center and fractionally rougher at the edges where the paper cutter had trimmed it. Portland Trust used it for formal financial correspondence. I did not remove it while he was still constructing his argument. I waited until he had arrived at the phrase, sole administrative authority, which was the phrase he intended as the capstone. The point after which he believed silence from my direction would read as concession. He completed the phrase. I pulled the document free from the folder and let it travel across the mahogany surface in a single, unhurried motion, sliding on the satin cloth until it reached the end of the table closest to where she had moved. She had left her seat 2 minutes earlier. She was 82 years old. She had been a public school teacher for 40 years before her retirement, and she had taught every subject at least once and had never, to my knowledge, permitted a student to use imprecision as a substitute for accuracy. She reached out and picked up the document. She lifted it to reading distance. She put on her glasses. The overhead spotlight caught the document's surface, and the number in the outstanding balance field, $1,200,000, was readable from the second row of guest tables. I watched her read it. I watched her lower the document 2 inches and then raise it again to reread the same line, the motion a person makes when the number is not what their prior understanding of the situation had prepared them to see. My father's hands came away from the lectern simultaneously, releasing the wood and dropping to his sides. The pocket watch swung outward and tapped the outside of his thigh once, twice, 3 times before he stilled it. His face had been moving through colors over the past 10 minutes in a progression that had now arrived at gray. Not the gray of neutral or calm, but the gray of a fire that has gone out, the gray of something that has consumed its available fuel. He looked at the document in her hands with the focused attention of a man staring at an outcome he calculated as impossible and that has in any case arrived. She had risen from her chair the moment the document landed on the table and was now gripping the back of a guest chair with both hands, the diamond catching the chandelier light as her knuckles whitened. The champagne she had set aside earlier was on the table at her elbow, and as she gripped the chair, the table shifted slightly, and the glass went over, spilling pale liquid in a quiet spreading across the white cloth. She did not look at it. Both hands had come up to cover her mouth. I placed the second document on the table beside the first. A bank statement showing a series of monthly transfers from a personal account into an entity incorporated in Vancouver, Washington, 14 months ago, billed as an academic records management company. That entity had produced 11 sets of university enrollment credentials in its 14 months of operation. One set bore my daughter's date of birth. One set bore the name that had been appearing in the Willis family newsletters for the past 2 years. I pressed 2 fingers onto the Portland Trust stamp on the first document and held them there for a count of 3, while the room read both documents simultaneously, and I did not say anything about what they meant, and I did not need to. She walked to the edge of the table and picked up both documents and held them in one hand, side by side, and looked at me steadily across the room. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the flat, clear projection of a woman who had spent 4 decades being heard in rooms with poor acoustics. With everything these papers represent, and given your standing at the institution holding these notes, I need to ask you directly. In what capacity are you here tonight? Her question occupied the air above the platform without dispersing. The kind of question that, once spoken, becomes the only question in the room, reorganizing everything else into background. 200 guests had stopped their private conversations. The service staff near the kitchen corridor had paused. My father made one attempt to straighten his posture behind the lectern and then abandoned it, his hand finding the wood again and settling there for support rather than authority. His eyes found mine, and in them was something I had not expected. Not anger, not the lawyer's reflex to contest and deflect, but something much older and more unguarded. The hope of a man who has misread the situation badly enough to believe that the person he wronged might be persuadable. He thought there was still a negotiation available. He had not yet understood that I was not here to negotiate. I reached into the inner pocket of my vest with 2 fingers and withdrew the card. It was matte black, laser engraved on both faces, the weight of it something a person holding it for the first time would notice. Not heavy exactly, but present in a way that printed cards are not. I placed it flat on the projector glass. The pale blue light passed through the engraved lines and expanded them onto the wall screen, clean and white, each character approximately 4 inches tall. Chair, Board of Directors, Hearth Home Interiors. And below it, in a smaller font that was still fully legible on the screen, Authorized Credit Committee Stakeholder, Portland Trust. The room read both lines. I stood still and let the reading happen at whatever pace the room required, which turned out to be somewhat longer than I had anticipated, because what the room was doing was not simply reading text, but reconciling text with the prior account it had been given of the person who had placed it there. My father moved forward from behind the lectern. He bent toward the screen with the posture of a man approaching something he needs to see at close range because he cannot believe it at distance. His reading glasses were on, and his eyes had narrowed to track each letter individually. He read through both lines. He straightened. Both hands came away from the lectern and fell to his sides. The pocket watch swung free and produced its small rhythmic tap against the outside of his thigh, keeping time with the breathing that had gone shallow and too frequent. The color that had left his face earlier did not return. The gray went deeper, acquiring a slight transparency, the quality of a material that has had too much pressure applied for too long and is beginning to show it at the surface. His lips moved. No sound emerged. He moved his lips again over the same text, reading it a second time without access to any of the mechanisms that had, over his entire career, made him someone other people watched because they expected the next thing he did to matter. He took 3 steps forward, not the steps of a man coming to contest something, but the steps of a man whose forward motion has not caught up with the fact that there is no longer anywhere to go. He stopped 2 feet from the projector table and his hand moved out, not toward me, but toward the card on the glass. the fingers extending in the way they move when a person is reaching for something without being certain the thing is real. His fingertips made contact with the glass surface to the left of the card and rested there for a moment without pressing, without taking anything. His legs bent at the knee, not a fall, not sudden. One knee settling toward the floor in the slow movement of a man whose legs have simply declined to continue the work of holding him upright. He caught himself with one hand on the table's edge. He stayed there, one knee down, one hand on the table, and looked at the card and at the lines of text above him on the screen, and at the space where his understanding of the situation had been, which was now empty. She had risen from her chair behind the lectern and was crossing the stage toward me, her right arm extended at shoulder height, palm open and forward, the gesture of a woman who believes she can still alter the outcome through physical contact. I moved one step to my left. The distance between us settled at 3 feet. Her arm remained extended for 2 seconds and then lowered slowly, not dropped, but lowered. The motion of a person allowing themselves to understand that the reach did not reach. I looked at her face throughout this, at the line where her foundation had begun to separate at the hairline from the perspiration, at the way her jaw was working without producing speech. The associate was at the table collecting papers, each sheet placed into his briefcase carefully, at a measured pace that was not the confident deliberateness of earlier, but the measured pace of a person trying to remove themselves from a room without the removal being visible. He did not look at my father. He had made a professional calculation, and the calculation did not include staying on a stage where the audience was rearranging its understanding of who had been telling the truth. My father looked up at me from where he had settled at the table edge. Not from the ground, he had caught himself, but lower than standing. His voice came out rough and stripped, without any of the architecture that had made it useful for his entire professional life. "Grace, why are you doing this?" I reached into the folder and opened the final section. The ballroom had arrived at a quality of silence that was different from the silences that had preceded the evening's earlier exchanges. Those silences had been generated by attention, 200 people choosing to listen rather than speak. This silence was generated by the absence of available responses. The room had run out of the next thing to say. The projector's cooling fan produced its low, steady hum, which had been inaudible until now, and the sound of it was the only sound in the space that did not carry any weight. I reached into the final section of the folder and my fingertips met paper that had a specific quality, distinguishing it from everything else I had brought into this room. It was original. Not a certified copy, not a scanned reproduction, not a printout from an archive database. The actual document, on the actual paper, with the actual ink applied by the actual pen, on the actual night in October 2004, when a notary had sat in a room in Portland and applied a state seal to the relinquishment of a 16-year-old's standing in her own family's record. My father had told his attorney the document had been burned. He had placed it in the fireplace on a November evening 2 weeks after that October night, had watched the paper catch and blacken and curl, had stayed until the fire consumed what he understood to be the last physical copy. He had not known that I had requested the original from the state-level secondary archive, a routine document preservation filing that his attorney had apparently also not read far enough into the governing process to discover, and that the state archive had released it to me on the basis of my standing as the named party. I drew it out. I placed it on the projector glass. I moved it into the center of the light field with 2 fingers and aligned the signature block with the lower third of the screen. His signature was there in blue-black ink, slightly spread at the corners from the pressure he had used. The specific heavy strokes of a man performing certainty. The date was in his own handwriting, smaller and more controlled than the signature. The clause he had drawn a double underline beneath read, "Permanent and irrevocable abandonment of all parental and filial obligations, inclusive of all current and future biological descendants of the undersigned party." I rested the tip of my index finger below the underlined clause and held it there without pressing. I did not say what it meant. I did not explain the context. I let the text perform its function in the silence of the room. He read it from where he was standing at the edge of the platform, and the reading took him longer than it should have because his eyes kept stopping at words and restarting from the same position, the way eyes move when the brain is refusing the content rather than processing it. His jaw moved. His face had reached the stage beyond gray, the stage that was more absence than presence, the face of a man whose available resources for expression had been exhausted. Both hands came down on the lectern surface simultaneously, not a controlled action, the hands arriving on wood because their owner's nervous system had produced the gesture before his mind could moderate it, a dense flat concussion that traveled through the floor of the platform and into the soles of my shoes. He gathered breath audibly, a short, hard pull through his nostrils, and his voice came out at full volume, stripped of every professional instrument he had ever applied to it. You ungrateful. I should have let you stay outside in the rain that night with what you were carrying. You think having money gives you the right to stand here and spit on a name that you abandoned 22 years ago. He grabbed the vase of white lilies from the table to his right with both hands and threw it. The vase struck the projector's side housing and broke, a single sharp explosive impact, and the white lilies, the water, the ceramic in 3 large pieces and a spray of smaller fragments spread across the stage floor, the water darkening the wood immediately. He lunged toward the projector table, both hands extended, the fingers spread, and reaching for the document on the glass. She stepped in from behind, not to restrain him, but because he was moving and she moved when he moved. The long habit of 2 people who have spent 5 decades in the same physical space, and her body between his and the table slowed him to a stop. She had pressed herself back against the velvet curtain at the platform's rear, the curtain deforming where her shoulders pressed into it and released with her breathing. The church elders at the front table had stood as a group, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with the coordinated quiet of people who have made a decision and are implementing it. They walked to the platform stairs and descended without speaking and did not look back. I reached forward and turned off the projector. The image on the screen disappeared. The room returned to amber. I folded the original document along its existing crease lines and put it in my vest pocket beside the metal card. The associate had arrived at the ballroom side exit with his briefcase. He passed through the door without looking in our direction. My father had stopped attempting to move forward. He was standing beside the lectern with his hands no longer on the wood, just standing, breathing in the incomplete way of a person who cannot quite get enough air to fill the space the situation has created. The dry sound that eventually came from his throat was not a word and not a cry. It was the residual sound of a man who has reached the end of his available responses and found nothing on the other side of them. The Heathman's main lobby had the particular quality of a space being systematically returned to its neutral state. The event staff moved through it in pairs, pulling the anniversary banners from their anchor points along the mezzanine railing, rolling the red carpet back on itself from the main entrance inward, carrying the white lily arrangements through the service corridor in batches. The vacuum had started somewhere behind the ballroom's service doors, its sound traveling through the marble floor as a low, continuous vibration that I felt through the soles of my shoes as I stood with my back against one of the lobby's stone columns. The stone was cold through my jacket, a specific grounding cold that moved against my spine and did not ask anything of me. I crossed my arms across my chest and rested there and watched the lobby. The Portland Trust attorney was at the concierge desk speaking in a low voice to the senior church elder while both of them looked at a document the elder had already signed. I did not need to read it from where I stood. I had written 3 of its 4 substantive clauses myself, in consultation with the trust law specialist my firm retained in Eugene, over 2 evenings 4 months ago. The document suspended all charitable and community funding distributions from the Willis Family Trust, pending a full financial audit, authorized by the Trust's Secondary Oversight Committee. A committee whose existence my father's attorney had apparently not read far enough into the governing charter to discover. He came from the direction of the ballroom's secondary exit. His jacket was still on, but the top two buttons of his shirt had come open, and his collar was damp, and the jacket sat on his shoulders at a slightly wrong angle, the kind of angle that indicates a person whose clothing has not fully settled from moving quickly and then stopping quickly. He crossed the lobby floor with a gait that was attempting steadiness and not quite achieving it. The walk of a person whose legs are receiving instructions from a different source than usual. He stopped 5 feet from me, then came 3 feet closer, then stopped again, which is closer than the situation's social logic permitted. He did not make eye contact. He looked at the floor to my left and then at my face, and then at the floor again. I did not speak. I waited. He said my name. He said he was sorry. He said it and then took a breath and said it again, with slightly different inflection. The repetition of a person who does not believe the first saying has landed. He told me he had known about the amended trust documents, had known about the Oxford records, had known that the entity named Lucas existed only as a set of files and printed names in newsletters, and had not, for a single day, ever been a person standing in any room. He said he had been afraid of losing his own share of the inheritance, and that this fear had made him a participant in something he could not now put into a category that did not describe him accurately. His voice lost whatever structure it had been maintaining. He brought both hands up to his face. He pressed them there and sat down on the marble floor with his back against the column across from mine, and pressed his forehead against the stone, once, and then a second time. The contact of someone applying the reality of a surface to the unreality of what they have done, and finding that the surface helps, marginally, in a way that nothing else at that moment is helping. Lily moved. She crossed the 5 feet between herself and him and placed her palm flat on the back of his shoulder. She held it there. She was 19 years old, and she was putting her hand on the shoulder of a man who had known her whole life that she existed and had allowed someone to print her birth record under a different gender and a different name in a newsletter read by 300 people every month, and she was doing this because she had decided to. I did not stop her. I kept my position against the column. I watched my daughter's hand on my brother's shoulder, and I did not cross the remaining distance between myself and them, because the remaining distance was not mine to cross. I noted that his crying increased at the touch rather than decreased, which is what happens when a person who has been isolated inside a very specific guilt is reached by the first contact offered without conditions. My mother had appeared near the mezzanine stairs, 10 feet away, standing with her coat already on and her clutch under her arm, watching the lobby the way a person watches a situation they have decided to exit, but have not yet found the timing for. She looked at my daughter's hand on his shoulder for 3 seconds. Then she looked at me for 2. Then she turned in the direction of the valet station. He stood eventually, using the column to get himself vertical. He wiped his face with the back of his wrist. He said he would testify. Whatever was needed. Hearings, depositions, written statements, for every proceeding. For Lily. For whatever the process required of him. I gave him one precise nod. Acknowledgement of a commitment made. Not forgiveness issued. Not warmth extended. And he received it with the expression of a person who understands exactly which category the nod belongs to, and accepts it in that category. At the far end of the lobby, near the corridor to the parking structure, my father had appeared. He was standing at the exit I would need to use. He was watching me. He was waiting. The corridor between the hotel and the parking structure was open on one side to the October night. A covered walkway with a railing along the outer edge and the dark pressing in from the west, carrying the first advanced drops of rain that had been building since early evening. He was standing at the far end of the corridor near the parking entrance, both hands wrapped around the railing's metal bar, the cold of it visible in the set of his fingers. Too tight, the grip of someone who has assigned the railing the work that his legs are no longer providing for free. His breath came in short exhales that were visible in the air in front of him, as pale, irregular clouds in the yellow light from the parking deck fixtures. He had been a tall man for most of his life, and he still was. But height, when everything that had animated it has gone, does not produce the same effect. He looked at the door I came through, and he found me immediately, which meant he had been watching the door. I walked to approximately 8 feet from his position and stopped. Lily was to my left. I kept my weight forward and my arms loose at my sides. I looked at his face, at the slackness in his jaw, and the puffiness around his eyes, and the way his grip on the railing was the only thing appearing to keep his posture from collapsing inward entirely. He released the railing with his right hand and extended it toward Lily, the gesture of a grandfather, warm and reaching, the physical language of a relationship that had never been permitted to exist. I moved one step to my left. The geometry of the corridor shifted and Lily was behind my shoulder. His extended hand stopped in the air and did not complete its trajectory. He withdrew it slowly and brought both hands together in front of him, fingers interlaced, and he looked at me the way a man looks at a person he has run out of leverage with and has not yet accepted that he has run out of leverage with. He spoke. His voice was not his courtroom voice and not his dinner table voice. It was smaller than either, operated on less pressure, the voice of a person who has been reduced to their last available register and is aware of the reduction. Grace, we are family. I am old and I cannot lose the firm. Your mother cannot lose the house. I am asking you for one word to the bank. Not a retraction, not a concession. One word, one phone call, and we handle the rest of this privately the way a family handles its private business. He stopped and waited. Behind him, at the far end of the corridor near the parking level access door, she stood in her coat with the collar turned up, facing partially away from us, the lamplight catching the side of her face. She had not come forward. She was not going to come forward. She was doing what she had always done in the moments that required a choice, positioning herself so that whatever happened next, she had not technically been present for it. I measured my breath. I took in the cold air moving through the corridor from the west. The specific cold of Portland in October, the kind that carries the first real indication of the season arriving as a fact, rather than a suggestion. My lungs filled with it, and I held it for a moment before releasing it slowly, and in the release, I felt the last of whatever tension the evening had been accumulating in my upper chest leave my body as vapor in the cold night air. I counted 5 heartbeats, even and unhurried. A man stood in front of me in an expensive, crumpled suit asking me to absorb the consequences of his own documented actions, framing the request in the language of family, which is the same language he had used in 2004 when he pushed a sheet of paper through a gap at the base of a door into the rain. The language had not changed. The currency had changed. 22 years ago, he was paying $10 for a notarization that he believed closed a chapter. Tonight, he was asking me to absorb $1.2 million in bridge loan liability in exchange for his use of the word family. The gap between those two offers was not a negotiating position. It was a self-portrait, rendered over 2 decades in the specific details of every action he had chosen when a different choice was available. I said one sentence. I said it at the volume of ordinary speech, with the same intonation I would have used to confirm the terms of a conference room booking. I already paid you back that $10 notary fee 22 years ago. There's nothing left outstanding between us. I turned my body. The turn was unhurried and complete. I walked past him along the corridor toward the parking deck entrance and maintained my stride and did not allow any part of my coat or my body to make contact with him as I passed, and I pressed the bar of the parking deck door and walked through it and let the door close behind me. He called my name. The sound arrived through the door and through the concrete of the structure, and I walked toward the car, and the sound diminished at the rate that sounds diminish when a person keeps walking away from them. I unlocked the car. I opened the passenger door for Lily. She got in. I walked to the driver's side and sat down and started the engine, and the headlights came on and lit the gray concrete ahead of us. In the mirror, the door to the corridor was closed and still. The rain had started in earnest, a real rain, steady and indifferent. The kind that does not ask whether this is a good time. It hit the roof of the car in a continuous, even sound. I put the car in drive. Before we go, and I know we have spent a long time in this room together tonight, I want to ask you one thing. If you could go back to the person who decided you were erasable, and you could say one true thing to them, not to change them, because some people are past changing, but only to return the weight of it, to hand back the thing you have been carrying for them without their knowledge or gratitude, what would you say? Write it in the comments. Write it for yourself, if for no one else. I will read every one of them, and I want you to know that someone is listening who is not going to tell you that you have misunderstood your own life. If tonight gave you something you needed, there is another story in the description below, and I will be there when you arrive. The rain covered the windshield completely for a moment before the wipers cleared it, and the hotel lights appeared briefly in the rearview mirror, small, yellow, receding. And then the road curved, and there was only the dark and the wet pavement ahead, and the sound of the engine and the rain. And I did not look for anything behind us in the mirror again.